Welcome to the program, Congressman Kinzinger.
It is great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
After months of discussions and debates, Congress has finally approved more than $60 million in aid for Ukraine. I would like to start with a personal question. Did you expect such an outcome?
So in the last few weeks, I have been talking to my, former colleagues and my friends, and they were convinced they would get this done. And that to me was a bit of a surprise because I was starting to get pretty concerned, like everybody. And this passing, I started to really kind of, my betting money was on it was going to get done. And I'm glad it did. I think there was a lot of information that got to Speaker Johnson, particularly, as you know, he's very concerned about religious issues and Christian issues. And I think when it came down about a lot of the Russian attacks on Ukrainian churches or evangelicals that have plight in Crimea, that made a difference. Even though that shouldn't be the thing that made a difference, I think it certainly helped to make a difference.
Let's cover also, after this question, we will cover the role of his faith, but I would like also to cover his shift. Mike Johnson previously opposed Ukraine aid, but he has changed his mind and allowed House to vote on Ukraine aid. What factors were decisive in his shift?
So it's interesting. When you are, before he was speaker, he was just a kind of a backbench member of Congress. To give you an example, I only probably had 2 conversations with him in the years that we worked together. Well, when you're just a member of Congress that, you can just vote how you need to vote to win re-election, you don't feel the depth of how important your vote is. So you can vote against things like Ukraine aid as long as you know it's going to pass, right? You give yourself a little no vote and hope everybody else votes to pass it. Well, when you become speaker, the decision is yours. And Mike Johnson alone was the one that would determine if Ukraine got the aid or not. And history would record his name either way. And I think that is much different when you know that it is your decision. It's a much different situation to be in than knowing you can vote against something and it still passes. And I think that's what the change was with Mike Johnson, was the understanding that without American support, Ukraine is willing to fight. But without American support, Ukraine would have a hard time standing.
Mike Johnson has also received some intelligence briefings from the National Security Team, from the White House. Did they play a significant role for him?
It sounds like it did. Between the White House briefings, the Intelligence Committee briefings, and the Foreign Affairs Committee. Look, I think what there was this belief was I don't know, if somehow Ukraine lost, Russia would just maybe occupy Donbass and then go back to living its own life and not worrying about its neighbors. Well, I think we have plenty of evidence to show that Russia has a much more empirical, a much more of a desire for an empire than just Eastern Ukraine. And I think that really woke him up as well. The fact that, look, Ukraine is willing to fight and do the fighting on behalf of the United States and the West, but they have to have the weapons to be able to do it. Morale is very important. Look, as a soldier myself, if morale is low, it doesn't matter what you're fighting for. It's hard to keep fighting. And when I'm sure, as all of you in Ukraine felt, it seemed like the West was abandoning you. And so morale was taking a hit. And when this bill passed, it was very clear that we are standing with you. And I'm sure morale is much better now. And I think he understood that all of that played a very important role. And quite honestly, if Russia wins or loses, will define the kind of world that your kids, my kids, and Mike Johnson's kids grow up in.
House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Michael McCall said that House Speaker Mike Johnson prayed over Ukraine aid. Has his faith played a significant, a decisive role in that?
I believe his faith has played a serious role. Look, you cannot be a follower of Jesus Christ, you cannot be a follower of Jesus Christ and believe that Russia's war against Ukraine is justified. I mean, all you have to do is look in the Bible and see everything the Bible talks about in the New Testament, particularly in the words of Jesus, to understand that it's okay to defend yourself. It's not okay to rape, pillage, murder, attack for no reason a country like Ukraine. And so I think Mike Johnson's faith played a role in that. I'm sure as as I have been in my own life, in quiet moments, when you're pondering and you're thinking about what is your role in this world and how will history remember you, those are things that in quiet times you think about. And I'm sure Ukraine's political leaders think about this all the time, and Ukraine's military thinks about this all the time. In those moments, you come to the right answer. And I think that's what happened with Mike Johnson. He came to the right answer, which is, I've got to support Ukraine because history is going to record this. And frankly, the world's watching, and there is no Jesus Christ I follow that would think that what Russia is doing is okay.
So it was only the alone decision of Mike Johnson that helped Ukraine to achieve this big aid package.
Well, it's interesting because you have to have a number of things that go right. Significant, it has to be able to pass the House. And this is an important thing to remember. 70% of the U.S. House and something like 80% of the Senate voted for this. Those are huge numbers. That's very big. And that's what, I think it's close to 70 to 80% of the American public supports Ukraine over Russia, which is huge in a very divided time. Politics is never easy. And so Mike Johnson was what I guess I would call a single point of failure. It wasn't just Mike Johnson that made the decision, but Mike Johnson alone could have decided to not bring this aid package to the floor. And so it was good that he did, obviously. And he's on the right side of history. And the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the people that, are somehow think Russia is this defender of civilization, their days passed, and it may take a while for them to get there, but they will be stains on the history of this country and this world.
You mentioned about those Republicans who voted against Ukraine aid. It's quite a significant numbers. More than 100 Republicans voted against Ukraine aid. What does it mean, and how could it influence the fate of the war in Ukraine in the future?
Well, let me say what I think it means is that there's a lot of cowards that serve in Congress. Because if this was a secret ballot, if they would not have had to vote publicly, I think the aid would have passed with 200 Republicans and maybe only 30 against. But for some reason, there has been this political pressure against aid for not just Ukraine, for Israel, for Taiwan, this idea that America needs to just retreat and lick our own wounds like that worked before World War II. It didn't work. And so I think there's some of that feeling that people are just scared to tell their constituents. But I guarantee you, had that been a secret ballot vote, 200 Republicans would have voted for it. And what does that say in the long term? It shows that as somebody that still calls myself a Republican, even though I don't really feel like one right now, we have our work cut out for us. We've got a lot of work to do to educate the next generation about the important role that America plays in this world, about the importance of democracy and freedom. But I think as we look at, initially there will have to be another aid package someday, 6 months from now or something like that. We need to not rest. We need to continue to educate people on that. But also, I want the Ukrainians to know that even Republicans stand behind them in this war. America stands behind you. And it's just important to continue to show the human face and the stories to what's happening there.
But what is the source of this political pressure not to support Ukraine? Is that Donald Trump or some other things?
Look, I think Donald Trump made opposing Ukraine, or at least supporting Russia, he made it okay. So he kind of gave permission to Republicans to do what was unthinkable. I mean, 5 years ago, the idea of supporting Russia was unthinkable. And so Donald Trump kind of gave permission for that. But what I really think, I mean, it could also be argued that Donald Trump signaled that he was okay with this aid to Ukraine that just passed. I don't know if Donald Trump is, pro-Kremlin and anti-Ukrainian. I think Donald Trump cares about one thing, Donald Trump. That's it. But I think we have to understand, and Ukraine understands this better than we do. There is a real Russian information war machine that is rotting the brains of people that get information from the Kremlin. The Kremlin, of course, would never let Western ideas into the Kremlin. So they'll censor anything. They'll censor what it really looks like. Why is it that Russian soldiers, when they invaded Ukraine, were surprised that you guys had washing machines and indoor plumbing? Because everything in Russia is censored because Vladimir Putin is scared to death. But we in the West let these corrosive, disgusting ideas in. And I think we have to take a look at that and understand, why is it that we have this one-way relationship with Russia where their poison can come into our societies, but we're not allowed in their societies to talk about the greatness of democracy and freedom. I think that's a significant part of what's going on today.
From your perspective, what did cause a shift in Donald Trump's position regarding Ukraine aid? Maybe his negotiations and talks with foreign leaders in Mar-a-Lago?
That's possible. I think, look, you have to understand Donald Trump as a completely deep narcissist who is so narcissistic that the only thing that matters is his own self. And so I think there was an understanding that, look, if Ukraine falls, if Ukraine loses to Russia, that's going to reflect badly on Donald Trump, too. I mean, he was president for 4 years. He could have armed Ukraine much better to defend itself against the Russian invasion, even though he somehow believes that Russia never would have invaded if he was president, which isn't true, by the way. Russia probably still would have invaded. But he could have, he obviously sent certain aid, and he could have sent more. So I think there's an understanding from Donald Trump that, Ukraine losing this war would not be good. Not good for the world, but certainly not good for Donald Trump's reputation. And so this is good news. I mean, I think we should take this, and I don't think Donald Trump is a good man. I want to be very clear, but I think he has shown that he's not drastically opposed to a Ukraine victory and Ukraine aid. And that's a good thing, especially because he could win. I don't think he will, but he could win the presidency.
We will later cover the US general election, but from your perspective, how could this positive vote in the House and the passage of the Ukraine aid influence future policy of Donald Trump in case if he is reelected?
Look, I think it could be very influential for his policy, because what we showed is that the House and the Senate, 75% of the House and Senate voted to support Ukraine. Look, as you know, the United States has a huge national debt. It's a real problem. I mean, $35 trillion is a lot of money. And still, with that national debt, we decided to support Ukraine because we understand that the Ukrainian people and the American people are very close. I mean, there's a number of Ukrainians in the United States, of course, and even far before the war. And we understand the importance of what you're doing. I think what this vote says for Donald Trump is, if you want to oppose Ukraine in the future, you've got a big coalition of people you have to turn against. If you want to pull out of NATO, the vast majority of the House and Senate, who is just as powerful as you, supports our inclusion in NATO. And so I think it would be a caution to Donald Trump to do anything drastic and crazy. And, look, I think it's just as likely if he wins that he says, fine, let's let Ukraine defend itself against Russia, and that he does that. So I have some pretty, look, I come out of this vote with a much better feeling about the future of the war in Ukraine and the U.S. support for it than I had probably before that.
You just said, and you just mentioned about the future support for Ukraine. Do you expect the same story to repeat in the future? I mean, those debates and discussions going on for months in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I hope not. Like, look, next time we have to do this, that this is done faster. You know, look, it would have been much better to have this aid package done in December, right? We would not be dealing with Ukrainian troops starved of shells at the front line right now. This should have been, and this is this should still be an embarrassment for the United States. Yes, we got the package done. Yes, it's good that Europe stepped up as much as they could, but this should not have been delayed. Obviously, Ukraine has to continue to work on its mobilization side of the effect, like getting, troops and people to fight this war. And so I think as long as Ukraine continues with its mobilization and getting its troops raised, and we continue providing this stuff on time, and that's going to be the key. I think next time this comes up, there is going to be an understanding, I hope, among people that there is no point in waiting. If it's going to get it done now. There is no point in waiting. And there will be victory in Ukraine. I hope sooner than later. But, evil has to be defeated. And the front lines of the fight against evil right now is in eastern Ukraine.
From your perspective, how do you see the current influence of Ukraine aid on the situation on the ground, on the state of war, from your perspective?
Well, look, obviously, you guys can answer that better than I can, but I would say that it's essential, right? I think, one of the good things, there's nothing good about it, but one of the things is at least Europe has understood that they have got to step up their domestic production of weapons. They have got to not rely just on the United States anymore. But I do think, obviously, we play a very unique, a role that only America can play in terms of the arsenal of democracy. We've been this for 100 years. And so I think from my perspective, American military support on the front line is really the difference between a Ukraine that can defend itself with high casualties or a Ukraine that can defend itself with less casualties and eventually prepare itself for a counterattack to liberate the territories that are illegally occupied by Russia now. Things like HIMARS, obviously very important. Weapons like ATACMS, obviously very important to putting the Russians on their heels and opening up all of Crimea. Look, I believe that the administration should allow Ukraine to use weapons in Russia because Russia has a war machine it's using against Ukraine. But at least to be able to open up Crimea is important. And most importantly is the production of 155 millimeter ammunition, artillery shells. Obviously, Ukraine and Russia are fighting an artillery war. This is very different than any war that we fought. And frankly, any war I think that's been fought since like Korea or World War II, but that's where we're at. So I think American military and support is going to be essential. Not to mention, hopefully, the F-16s get online pretty soon.
Let's cover also the US general election. A recent poll by Reuters Ipsos shows that President Joe Biden has an advantage over Trump in 4%. From your perspective, does it mean that President Biden have a fair chance to be reelected?
It does. Look, I think in any given day between now and the election, it's really going to be 50-50. I think if I had to predict, and I've been wrong before, I never thought Donald Trump would ever be president, so take that for what it's worth. But if I had to predict, I would say Joe Biden will win re-election. But it's going to be very close, which means that it could be Donald Trump. Look, the economy in the United States is good, but people feel like it's bad. And so a lot of that comes into play when they vote. I also think Ukraine continuing to be able to defend itself and the importance of Ukraine defending itself will be a deciding factor for Joe Biden. To give you an example, the 20% of Republicans like me who would have voted for Nikki Haley, who still don't like Donald Trump. We don't like Donald Trump for a number of reasons, but part of the thing that we're very disgusted with our party is it apparently turning its back on Ukraine. So a Ukraine victory is very important to Joe Biden, but that's how you also win about 20 to 25% of the Republicans to your side to vote Democrat this year. So it'll be an interesting election year, and I think Ukraine's going to play front and center, but I don't think a president is necessarily going to win or lose based on Ukraine. It'll be things like economy and just how Americans feel about stuff in general. You guys, look, I know that Ukrainian politics, particularly prior to the war, was very divided, and it's not much different here in the United States either.
You said that American economy is good, but people feel like it is bad. How it is possible? Why?
You know, and I understand that sitting in Ukraine right now and dealing with a war has got to be especially frustrating to look at America with a good economy and say, you know, that everybody's complaining about it. Well, look, here, we're the victim a little bit of always having a good economy. When you always have a good economy, a small decrease in growth or a little bit of an uptick in inflation makes you feel miserable. I think the other thing is just it's part of this new environment with social media where everything looks better because everybody posts their best moment except your moment in life. And so you feel like in relative to everybody else, you're doing worse. And I think also too, the Biden administration probably needs to do a better job of talking about what they've done for the economy. But I also try to remind people how lucky we are to be Americans, because even when the economy is bad here, it's usually better than it is in most of the other part of the world. So, but yeah, unfortunately, that is the reality of how politics works.
How could you also assess chances for Republicans and Democrats to be reelected in the House and Senate?
I would actually be very surprised if Republicans hold the House. So I think it's very likely that Democrats are going to win the House of Representatives because, look, I mean, the majority is so close. Obviously, it's 1 or 2 seats, closest it's been ever, as far as I know. And people aren't very happy with Republican leadership in the House, quite honestly. The Senate is a little different because only 1/3 of the Senate comes up for election every 2 years. And right now it happens to be seats that are more likely to vote Republican. So it is, I think, probably more than likely that Republicans win the Senate. Now, that said, Senate Republicans tend to be very good on the issue of Ukraine, tend to be very good on the issue of foreign policy in general. So a Republican Senate does not necessarily mean bad things for Ukraine. I do think a Republican House, as we've seen, means slower aid to Ukraine. And so me personally, I would like to see a Democratic House, probably a Democratic Senate, but as a Republican, I think Republicans in the Senate would be fine. And I'd like to see Joe Biden reelected because I believe the war in Ukraine is so important that my party doesn't matter in comparison to Ukraine defending itself and liberating its territory.
How do you see the fate of the far-right Republicans in the House after they failed to block Ukraine aid?
Well, they've become less important. You know, look, the most important person in a room, if you give everybody in the room a hand grenade, you're all powerful. But if one person is willing to pull the pin on that hand grenade, they become the most powerful person in the room. And that's what people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and the far right were. They were the ones willing to do things that nobody else would do, like pull the pin on the hand grenade. And so when they pulled the pin and people called their bluff and they lost, they basically showed that that they had no power. And so I think the power of the far right has been certainly damaged in the last few months. That doesn't mean it's over, but I think it's been significantly damaged.
Did they bluff to vacate Mike Johnson?
I think that Marjorie Taylor Greene intended to vacate Mike Johnson, but I think she couldn't get the support. And that goes to show you know, you can tell people you're powerful, but ultimately somebody's going to be able to find out. And so she's only got 3 people right now supporting it. They may make an effort to still vacate, but the Democrats have signaled that they would save Mike Johnson because of Ukraine if they need to. And so I think ultimately she wanted to vacate, but they showed their hands and they didn't have the power to do it.
Thank you, Congressman Kinzinger, for your time and for your support for Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini, anytime. Thank you.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.